as many of you will know, she graduated with her PhD this March here at St Mary's. And Michael had been working with Karen for some years on her PhD. Not many people know that when Karen got her doctorate in March, she was able to wear Michael's own sari PhD robes for the ceremony. But the fruits of Karen's PhD dissertation have now been published in a report form here, Research among Catholic Young Adults in England and Wales, How to Disrupt the Limbo of Non-Belonging, which St Mary's has now published. You've all got copies under the auspices of the Aquinas Centre. So it's very good to be able to promote this evening and to pay tribute to Karen's work, directed so well for many years by Father Hayes. Thank you very much.
It's one of the wonderful things, I think, about coming together like this. I like to describe what we're trying to do here as charity seeking clarity. We've talked about accompaniment, and we've also got the great minds of many of our speakers that are coming. This talk this evening is part of the Michael Hayes Memorial Lecture. I think before I get Ant to introduce a little bit of the vision of why we're having this memorial lecture and to introduce our speaker for this evening, I think it's appropriate just to take a moment of time to pray. Not only to pray for the repose of the soul of Michael, but also to pray for Professor Gerald Collins, who is our speaker for this evening. To pray in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual Holy Father, we ask you to send your Holy Spirit among here this evening to help to soften our hearts, to give us a heart of flesh, that we might be able to hear your words and to accompany people, to be able to journey with people in charity, seeking clarity. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Towie to introduce our speaker this evening. Thank you.
It's good to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I know it's a late hour. I know that Karen will want to build on the announcement tonight. She's got a workshop tomorrow. It's in direct opposition to Professor O'Collins's workshop, but that's the way the cookie tends to crumble these days. So if you want to follow up on that doctoral work that Michael supervised and work with Karen, that will be happening tomorrow. We've got this duty really. This conference has been sponsored by the Pastoral Review, many of you know that, and hopefully a lot of you subscribe to it. It started off as a clergy review, then it became Priests and People, now it is the Pastoral Review, and this is the first Pastoral Review Congress. And we thought it fitting to have a keynote given by Father Gerald Collins, Professor of the Gregorian University, an Australian Catholic University. Jerry is an absolute force of nature when it's come to post-conciliar theology. He's produced 75 books. I'm not sure. I remember talking to him when he produced his 50th, and I kind of made some kind of cricketing metaphor. I think he's going for a Bradman score. I think he's settling in for to do something. And he was a great influence on Michael. He's a great influence on many of us. There are priests here who've come, certainly one from Quex Road, far and wide, to listen to Father Jerry. He was such a great influence in Rome for many years. Jerry's speciality, if you can say, he's contributed across Christology, the study of the life of Jesus, the resurrection, a particular forte, and also he has been a sought-after commentator on, if you like, the church in the news. He's a bit of a Vatican insider. He's never divulged his sources to me. But he's been the BBC. He's worked for the BBC and Italian television, and commentated on the Papacy over these last eventful decades. He's come all the way from Australia, which is a tribute to his affection for Michael Hayes, a tribute to his affection for the Pastoral Review, and a tribute to his affection for St Mary's, where Father Jerry was full professor here for 4 years. 08 to 12, something like that, wasn't it? I should know. But anyway, it's all going a bit foggy, even for me. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor O'Collins to look at the way in which the work of the Pastoral Review has chimed, mirrored, connected with trends in papal pastoral approaches, trends in papal thinking, the way the Church is trying to be Church today. Thank you.
Apropos of books, I take comfort in that saying, his sins were scarlet, but his books were red. I hope you've all got a copy of the handout. It's just a sheet. It helps to guide you through what I'm wanting to present to you. Many of the events, dramatic events in world history, they fix themselves in our memories forever. Some of those in the older generation here will remember that day in November 1963 when President Kennedy was shot. We can remember where we were and how we received that news. And then a bit later, the attempted assassination of John Paul II in 1981. And much more recently, of course, many people will recall where they were and how they felt when they were informed that Pope Benedict XVI had announced his resignation. Now, it was characteristic of Michael Hayes that in the first editorial he published after that news, he didn't indulge in personal reminiscences. He could have recalled, for example, the visit in 2010 by Pope Benedict to St Mary's and how he met him here and presented him with a copy of a book that he'd co-edited. Michael reacted to the dramatic news of the resignation of Benedict by turning rather to the New Testament and quoting some of the great passages about the Petrine ministry, in particular the one from John 21, where Jesus questions Peter 3 times about his love. And looking forward to the coming papal conclave, Michael insisted that there's only one criterion that's absolutely necessary, that the criterion of love. I couldn't agree with him more, because I was there in Rome for several conclaves, and you'd find the pundits listing the qualities they wanted in the new Pope. And sometimes I thought not even Jesus Christ would live up to that standard. But all these languages, etc., Michael cut through to the heart of the matter, that the criterion is love. And that was the question that Jesus put 3 times to Peter. In that same issue of the Pastoral Review, Michael included studies by a study by Thomas O'Loughlin on the ministry, vocation and life. And Thomas O'Loughlin rightly said that the resignation of Benedict enabled us to distinguish between his personal individual vocation as a human being, baptised Christian, and his papal ministry. And he made the very good point that this is true of all of us. We might have some public ministry, like being ambassador to the Holy See, but we've also got our personal ministry. And Michael and O'Loughlin offered a very reasoned, twofold reaction to Benedict's dramatic resignation. By the time the next issue of Pastoral Review appeared, Pope Francis had been elected, and Michael left it to Thomas O'Loughlin and myself to write about the new Pope. O'Loughlin contributed an article, A New Bishop of Rome, and I wrote about Bergoglio as a Jesuit Pope. But Michael, in his editorial, was very intuitive, prophetic. He talked about the beauty of Christian life. The gift to Christians of beauty it's a gift and a challenge. And by bringing in that theme of beauty, I think Michael displayed his prophetic instincts. What I mean is this: back in the Second Vatican Council and its 16 documents, you find a great deal of stress on truth and goodness. on truth and justice. Over and over again, the documents of the Second Vatican Council stress those two important themes, but there's very little in Vatican II about beauty. It's singularly lacking, really. There's a little bit at the end, but not much. And Pope Francis, of course, would go beyond the Second Vatican Council in different ways, and in particular by developing the theme of beauty. In his exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis wrote repeatedly about the beauty of the saving love of God. And in Laudato Si', his 2015 encyclical on ecology and our common home of the earth, he continued his stress on beauty, over and over again, stressing the beauty of God's creation, the beauty of God's gifts to us, and calling on us to protect life and beauty. And Amoris Laetitia, the exhortation on the beauty of married life and family life, once again you had that stress on beauty. So rereading what Michael Hayes wrote in that editorial, I found him very prophetic. He picked up something that was going to prove a very important theme in the teaching ministry of Pope Francis, a golden thread running through his teaching, but also his public gestures. Right from the inaugural Mass there, you may remember how he stopped the Pope-mobile, got down and embraced a child who was very disfigured. It was an incredibly beautiful gesture. I was lucky enough to see that broadcast with a number of students, and students react better, I find, than most of us adults to situations. They appreciated the beauty of that gesture. In the issue for 2013, September, October, Michael included other articles on Pope Francis. Patricia Rumsey, I don't know whether she's here, I'd love to meet her if she's here, but perhaps she's not. And she was commenting on his having washed women's feet, that back on Holy Thursday that year, the Pope got down on his knees and washed feet, including the feet of two women. And she added at the end of her article, what an inspiration it would be at the end of Lent next year if the media carried pictures of Pope Francis having his feet washed by a woman. Well, the Pope, of course, has continued his habit of washing the feet of men and women, but we still don't have that photograph that she wants. Perhaps she should have asked him for it. I wouldn't be surprised if he'd do it. And if somebody lets him know there's a desire to see other people washing his feet and not merely his washing their feet. Thomas O'Loughlin again pointed out to us what was at stake in that beautiful gesture, that ultimately it's pointless to argue about the feet of men and women. O'Loughlin went to the heart of the matter, that in John chapter 13, the Gospel of John wants each person to wash the feet of others and to have their feet washed by them. And O'Loughlin was delighted when Pope Francis officially decreed, he felt he needed to do that, not merely offer his example, but leave an official decree that, one washes the feet of women, as many priests have been doing for years, actually. Well, so much by way of introductory remarks. Let's come to the first part of my presentation, first major part, namely Michael Hayes' reaction to the major publications of Pope Francis, The Joy of the Gospel, Laudato Si' on ecology, and Amoris Laetitia. And remember too how the third document in that trilogy was published during the Year of Mercy, that striking papal initiative that ran from late 2015 to 2016. What was done in the Pastoral Review to promote and apply those documents in that Year of Mercy? Well, Michael Hayes saw that the Pastoral Review quickly took up Evangelii Gaudium. Ronald Witherup had an article immediately bringing out the key messages of that document. I think it's one of the most remarkable papal documents ever produced. You have to go back to somebody like Pope Gregory the Great in the early church for something that's so splendid, beautiful and pastoral. Michael noticed, for example, the strong emphasis on homilies and their preparation, and that encouraged him to enlist me in writing some suggestions for homilies, preaching that could set Hearts on Fire. I hope I'm hearing what Duncan would like to say about that exhortation and the theme of preaching. And the homily, Francis wrote, can actually be an intense and happy experience of the Spirit, a consoling encounter with God's Word, a constant source of renewal and growth. Maybe we did see an example of that with Bishop Michael Curry recently on the royal wedding. It was a great gleam of light, that wedding in Australia. There's a terrible lot of ideology and argument out there, but people rallied around to enjoy immensely that wedding, and also that sermon by Michael Curry set in terms of love and the power of love in our world. As a Jesuit, of course, I was very glad to hear the bishop bringing in Teilhard de Chardin. And of course, it wasn't the occasion to remark about the causality of love. Love's very mysterious, but it's very powerful. If people are loved, they grow. If they're not loved, they shrivel up. And you can't weigh love, you can't measure it, but it is a great force in our world. Teilhard de Chardin thought of it that way, as, you know, as a force of nature, and mysterious but very real. And if it's there, things happen. If it's not there, things fail to happen. Evangelii Gaudium, to continue on that document and Michael Hayes's reaction, he used that phrase that he'd used elsewhere of taking on the smell of the sheep. There's an awful lot of sheep in Australia, millions and millions of them. And we resonate sometimes with Argentinians. They have a similar climate. They've also got lots of cattle and sheep, and we've liked that, taking on the smell of the sheep. You can express that point more solemnly by talking about servant leadership. And Bill Byron, Michael Hayes, took on an article by him about servant leadership and how important it is, not just in business and industry and politics, but also in the church. And it's very much embodied by Pope Francis and in his own way by Michael Hayes himself. Michael had articles about the beauty of the liturgy. That's a theme of that exhortation by the Pope. He enlisted Andrew Cameron Mowat to write about that, the beauty of liturgy as part of the joy of the gospel. And there's no joy in our Christian life. There's no joy in our liturgy. Well, something is absolutely essential is missing. Well, I could go on, rave on about the themes of Evangelii Gaudium that Michael endorsed and applied and took on in the Pastoral Review, the pastoral implications for lives of parishes. And then somebody picked up the 6 saints that Pope Francis had canonised at that point and showed how each of those 6 people, men and women, exemplified the ideal of the joy of the gospel. Living here and now, they showed the joy of the gospel on earth, the joy that will live to the full in the life of heavenly joy to come. Then there were these sterner themes in Evangelii Gaudium that Michael did not neglect. For example, care for migrants, refugees and asylum-seekers, ever so much so important, and one of the very shameful things in Australia, the way asylum-seekers have been stuck in Manus Islands for years. It's something that as an Australian, I hanged on my head in shame that, you know, our people accepted that and both parties accepted that. So there were these sterner themes when the Pope spoke out against human trafficking and for refugees, against modern slavery in its different forms, and sticking up for refugees and migrants. So Michael Hayes had good material on that, applying and highlighting those themes in Evangelii Gaudium. Let me move next to the Ecology encyclical Laudato Si. The Pope had mentioned that in his earlier writing, but here you've got this fully deployed statement on ecology and our care for our common home. And Michael greeted his publication with an editorial and an important article by Ashley Beck. I suppose Ashley's not here tonight. Oh, here he is. Yes, I really want to get together with you. So, and thank you for that and so many other articles. And also Peter Tyler, Michael had him provide an article on integrated humanity and integrated ecology. He wasn't the only one, but an ecological spirituality appeared there in the pages of the Pastoral Review. It was a nice building on the papal encyclical. It's the only papal encyclical so far. He did produce Lumen Fidei, but it's not really his encyclical, it's Benedict's. It was a very nice gesture that. Benedict had done an encyclical on love, the Deus Caritas Est. Then he did an encyclical on hope, and he was preparing an encyclical on faith. And Francis saw to it that was published, that the only time a pope's ever written encyclicals on faith, hope and love, he took them in the order of love, hope and faith. Then there's Amoris Laetitia, coming out more or less in the middle of the year of mercy. And merciful love is part of the opportunity, the challenge of married and family life. And we had Raphael Gallagher picking that up and contributing a rich pastoral voice in support of Amoris Laetitia. Michael did as much as he could to support the Year of Mercy. He really warmed to that papal initiative, and editorials and articles. Like the Pope, he took on board some of the language of Walter Casper, The Essence of the Gospel and the Key to Christian Life. And Casper had important things to say about mercy as justice, holiness and compassion. I mean, justice is not ruled out by mercy, and mercy is part of our call to holiness. And above all, of course, mercy means compassion. And Michael, like the Pope, cited the prodigal son story, which could be much better called the parable of the merciful father. We're stuck with that name, the prodigal son, but in German, der Verloren, and so on, the lost son, but really it's a parable of the merciful father. Ronald Witherup chipped in there for Michael with articles on the Year of Mercy, quite a number of them, and pointing out how the Year of Mercy coincided very much with the Gospel for the year. Luke is the Gospel of Mercy, and so the Pope was very liturgical in choosing that particular year to feature mercy. I think Bridie Stringer's here somewhere, and she chipped in with a reflection on the case of people who don't feel welcome in the Year of Mercy. She had that striking language about people who do not wish to darken our door in the first place, and they certainly don't want to darken the holy door of a church. And it was a nice picking up that Michael encouraged to reflect on people that really don't feel like accepting mercy. I mean, in the giving of mercy, there's also the accepting of mercy, and she rightly demonstrated how significant and difficult that could be. There was more that came in apropos of the theme of mercy that Michael sponsored in that Year of Mercy, school leadership that calls for mercy, and then mercy as a redemption for conflict and addiction and illusions. And then Adrian Graffey rounded off the series well by writing about the theme in the Old Testament. It's very central there in the Jewish scriptures, the theme of mercy. Michael himself used the Psalms. He editorialised about mercy using the Psalms, where the theme of mercy is very central. And he also took up the corporal works of mercy. He thought they were very apt for the Year of Mercy, and the Year of Mercy was calling on us to practice those corporal works of mercy. Jesus gave us 6 in Matthew 25, and then Christian tradition added the further one, burying the dead. It fits in nicely, not just visiting prisoners and the sick and feeding the hungry, but also burying the dead. Michael himself, I suppose, embodied one great work of mercy as a teacher. He was a teacher with soul, to use a phrase from Pope Francis. He showed himself to be one of those people that Francis highlights as teachers with soul. He gave himself a lifetime to the great work of mercy, education. Many of you here would be in that work, quite a whole lot of women and men here present, and it is a great work of mercy. I was ignorant and you taught me. You might want to put that under the spiritual works of mercy. It doesn't matter whether you think of it as corporal or spiritual or both. And Michael, like the Pope, wanted us to deploy in education a work of mercy. During that year of the work of mercy, Michael Hayes saw to it that the official logo created by that Slovenian artist Marko Rupnik, it appeared on the cover and in the pages of the Pastoral Review. Remember that logo showing the Good Shepherd with a sheep on his shoulders, and it carries the words, merciful like the Father. Marko Rupnik's a remarkable modern painter and also worker in mosaics. He was the one who was commissioned to renovate the Vatican Chapel of Redemptoris Mater. You have to get special permission to get in there, but it's the most remarkable modern work of Christian art. It's very close to the Sistine Chapel. Sistine Chapel, of course, highlights God's judgment. And just a few yards away, you've got the Chapel of Redemptoris Mater, which is radiant with the light of divine mercy. Pope Francis was elected in the Sistine Chapel, but he belongs much more in Redemptoris Mater because of his luminous message of mercy. And Michael Hayes himself belongs much more with Pope Francis and Marko Rupnik in the Chapel of Redemptoris Mater, much more than with Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. I finally got around to using a little bit of the art of Marko Rupnik and as a cover for a book. I have a book coming at the end of the year on Christian tradition with Oxford University Press, and they picked out a lovely image from of the Virgin Mary, that great bearer of tradition, from Marko Rupnik's work in Redemptoris Mater as the cover. I think he knows, or does he? I haven't broken the news to him that I've finally got round to endorsing his work in that way. Well, so far I've been talking about how the Pastoral Review received and applied the teaching of Pope Francis in the teaching above all in Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and then the joy of love. In the second part, I'd like to address myself to pastoral theology. Michael endorsed and encouraged a pastoral theology that would support pastoral ministry. And there's a number of points to be made here, but let me begin with a remark of Stephanie Bennett. And when Michael died, one of the tributes paid came from Stephanie, who had worked for years so closely with Michael in producing the Pastoral Review. And she recalled he would send me his editorials at the 11th hour, often from some far-flung place. He called them his offerings. The best tribute I can think of is to read all his editorials. Their vast knowledge combined with precision of thought and clarity of expression make for joyful reading. She highlighted that, the joyful reading that was there available in Michael's editorials. Well, the editorials of that, they're joyful, and Stephanie encouraged me really to think of the other aspects of Michael's pastoral theology, not only joyful, but also collegial, experiential, imaginative, well-informed, and concerned with communication. On the guide sheet, I've highlighted in bold those 6 characteristics. Let me take them up in turn. Michael pulsated with what the Pope had called the joy of the gospel, the joy that fills the hearts and lives of those who encounter Jesus. And it was a happy theology, inspiring and joyful, taking up Evangelii Gaudium and the other writings and teachings of the Pope that made Michael's pastoral theology joyful theology. And then secondly, it was collegial. During the years in Rome, I used to reflect sometimes, a bit sadly, and you had groups like the Federation of the Asian Bishops' Conference producing wonderful documents, but never being cited by John Paul II, as if they belonged to a different world. Some very illuminating documents produced by Indian and Chinese and Korean bishops. But the Pope was very collegial, Francis, And in his encyclicals and exhortations, you find him quoting statements of bishops from the Argentines, from Australia, Chile, Colombia, Italy, Kenya, Korea, Mexico, and Spain. What is the Spirit saying to the churches? It's very collegial, and often he has some very powerful statements to quote from there. They were singularly lacking. It was even more painful at the time of the Holy Year in 2000, when you had a document on the church in Asia. Well, where is the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conferences? It wasn't there. And Pope Francis has remedied that rather daunting omission. And in particular, before he produced Amoris Laetitia, the Pope had that synod of bishops in Rome, which met for 2 sessions on marriage and the vocation of the family life. And when he produced Amoris Laetitia, he quotes that document 75 times, sometimes at length, even at page length. It's quite a remarkable document that it has to be read with his exhortation. The two together are very illuminating, and the Pope being very collegial in what he's drawing and emphasising from that final report of the 2 synods. I think that Michael Hayes showed the similar kind of collegial team spirit in what he achieved in the pages of the Pastoral Review. His stable of contributors included older people, younger people, men, women, clergy, including permanent deacons. Are there any permanent deacons here? Yes, there we go, it's Duncan, thank you. And his stable of contributors was very collegial. He included those who were born Catholics, they'd become them, practising Christians as well as Catholics, writers from the British Isles, North America and elsewhere. And I think in his editorial work, Michael showed the same kind of collegial spirit, recognising how every baptised Christian has something worthwhile to say. It's a bit sad to say that, the simple faithful are not theologians. I think all the faithful are theologians. Every baptised and practising Christian has got something to say about their faith, about his or her faith. And Michael understood that and drew on everybody in a collegial way to enrich the pages of the Pastoral Review. Then thirdly, his review was deeply experiential. You might call the Pastoral Review the experiential review. There's so much experience there in page after page, and not just from pastoral theologians, but from everybody. And at the end of the day, unless pastoral theology is deeply rooted in experience, it's really not worth having. Unless it's coming out of experience and leading to it, what's the point? And I've always found it a very experiential review. I never said it to Michael during his lifetime that he could have as a subtitle Pastoral Review, Experiential Review. In Dutch, there's an old word to experience, ervaren, and at the heart of that verb is the varen, V-A-R-E-N, to travel by boat. And when you think of the Dutch and travelling by boat, one can think of a horse pulling a barge along a canal, or boats being rowed, or else a following wind filling the sails of a boat. Christian experience can take those different forms. At times our experience of Christian life may seem like rowing laboriously or plodding along or even being pulled along. And other times, of course, where wind has filled our sails and carrying us along. It's an image you get in Tony de Mello about the wind in our sails, and Christian experience should be like that. But it won't always be that way. Wind can drop and we can be becalmed. So Michael respected, I think, the different moods of Christian experience, the easier ones and the harder ones, the ones we have to cope with and the ones we rejoice in. And he set his journal to respond to the deepest yearnings of people's heart. The Pope wanted people to look into their hearts and see there a hole that only Jesus could fill. He is ultimately the only one that can give us that deep happiness that no one can ever take away from us. We experience him in other men and women, feeding us enlightening us. And like the Pope, Michael Hayes, of course, wanted to learn from the poor. There was a leap forward in what Pope Francis had to write and say. You know, for many centuries, of course, we were called to serve the poor, care about them, sacrifice ourselves from them. But I think you had to wait for Jean Vanier and Pope Francis to hear the theme, we must learn from them, that they have something to say to us, even be evangelised by him. That was the language, has been the language of Francis. He doesn't coin a beatitude in those terms, but he could. Blessed are the poor, because out of their experience they have much to teach us. The poor can teach us a great deal, and Michael Hayes was at one with the Pope in agreeing with that. So theology is experiential, learning from everybody in a particular way from the poor. It's also imaginative, my fourth point. Pope Francis and Michael Hayes were at home in the world of literature and art. The Pope, he not only quotes writers like the Nobel laureate Mario Benedetti, but I think he's the first Pope ever to quote a film, Babette's Feast. I don't think any Pope ever used, a film the way he did. And his imaginative sense spanned not only literature but also films. And Michael, posthumously, the Pastoral Review published that reflection of Michael on the sacramental imagination. Like the Pope, he had a sacramental imagination. And in that excerpt, you have Michael reflecting on the work of a Colombian artist, Alexandro Obregón. It came in a visit he made to Colombia, speaking in front of a great glass image created by that artist in Barranquilla, port city in the north of Colombia. So Michael used that image. He used Elgar's music. He used Newman's The Dream of Gerontius. That his theology, pastoral theology, was imaginative. Then fifthly, being imaginative doesn't mean being uninformed. It's not, an imaginative head is not an empty head. It's imagination and appropriate scholarship. My favourite example of this from Pope Francis is the real scholarship that underlay what he had to say about the discernment for Catholics who were divorced and civilly remarried and reception of reconciliation and Holy Communion. He retrieved their teaching from the fathers of the Church, people like Cyril of Alexandria, and retrieved a theme from the early Church about the medicinal and forgiving power of the Eucharist. He could have added to that. He could have quoted some of the early prayers of the Latin Rite, which talks about the Eucharist as forgiving sins. If you take that serious, there's, it's a post-communion prayer, very old ones, that the Eucharist is there not just as a reward for the virtuous, but as a means of sins being forgiven. And so it's not received, that doesn't happen. It's a rather startling implication of those early post-communions, which are still there in our liturgy, some of them. So, and Pope Francis, of course, retrieved Aquinas on the distinction between general rules, which are untampered with, and specific circumstances. It's one thing to hold that marriage is exclusive and permanent and so on, but when one moves to details and the complexities of particular cases, things are not necessarily quite so clear. So good scholarship backed up what Pope Francis had to say in that controversial section of Amoris Laetitia. You find the same kind of scholarship backing up things that Michael Hayes had to write. He appealed to the group psychotherapy of one writer and then the social psychologist Abraham Maslow in another. And I loved his image of the difference between orchids and mistletoe. I'd never realised that orchids, yes, they live and grow on another plant, but they give something to that plant, whereas mistletoe doesn't. Mistletoe draws and destroys without rendering any service to its host. So orchids are organisms that give sustenance and help to the plant, unlike mistletoe. And Mike was saying that in terms of bishops. that they should be life-giving orchids and not parasitic mistletoe. So long live bishops as orchids, and may those who are parasitic mistletoe repent of their situation. Then sixthly and finally, the question of communication. In a wonderful passage in Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope has this to say about preaching, but it applies equally well to liturgical texts. Pope Francis wrote, "Just as all of us like to be spoken to in our mother tongue, so too, in the faith, we like to be spoken to in our mother culture, our native language, and our heart will be better disposed to listen. Language is a kind of music which inspires encouragement, strength and enthusiasm." Lovely reflection on good preaching and good liturgical texts. Well, it hasn't happened to us in the English-speaking world. It's not so in Italian. Each week I console myself by saying Mass for a group of Italians. It's wonderful language. Dio è buono, è grande nell'amore. I mean, it rolls off your tongue. It's an excellent translation and hasn't been tampered with. And the same thing is true in German. A different kind of language, genius, but it is the mother tongue, recognisable as such, inspiring encouragement, strength and enthusiasm. Well, as we all know, the Pope put together a team to look at Liturgiam Authenticam, the guidelines which, ill-informed guidelines which lay behind the 2010 translation. And now he's left it to bishops to take the initiative and, play their role in giving people a more suitable and effective language of communication in the liturgy. Michael Hayes himself, Francis was hardly there before the Pastoral Review began seriously questioning the translation with which the English-speaking church has been saddled. He had an article by Zoe Davis. She remarked that the Eucharistic liturgy should be the source and summit of our life of prayer. Source and summit of our life of prayer, whereas it sounds strange, alienating, and often incomprehensible. And who was it? Sweeney, James Sweeney. He observed that the liturgy has become an obstacle between priest and people. And then Jean Reardon, "I'm now reduced from active participant to passive bystander." So, I got into that business and did a book with John Wilkins on Lost in Translation. Every review it's had has been very positive. I've never had a book that got good reviews from Times Literary Supplement, Theological Studies, every one of them. But I could dispense with the reviews provided I could get action from the hierarchy. I'm putting my money on the New Zealand bishops that they may, lead the way. They, of course, they're in a country where we've got Maoris, and there's a Maori liturgy which is good, and Maori priests. When I've been down there, I haven't had the courage to rub noses. That's the correct thing, but it's because they've got a bilingual church there. It shows up the deficiency of the English translation, whereas the Maori translation is good. I think something like that obtains in Canada, which has got the two languages. One officially not so great, and the other one good French. One of the secrets, of course, is I'm not going to mention the country, but there's some bishops in a particular country never took on the new translation. They never said anything about it, but they didn't take it up. They just left it. Well, there we are. Pastoral sensitivity is involved there in communication, which was very dear to the heart of Pope Francis and Michael Hayes. So on that guide sheet, you'll see my 6 characteristics of healthy pastoral theology. That should be joyful, collegial, experiential, imaginative, well-informed, and committed to communication. And I think that's been a distinctive characteristic of the pontificate of Pope Francis, and also Michael Hayes in the Pastoral Review. He never said that, but you could see those 6 characteristics as informing his work. My presentation this evening is focused on his published texts. There's so much else you could say about Michael, his his work at Roehampton and what he contributed here, and then in his last years at Mary Immaculate College, Limerick. He did a great deal for those institutions, but I thought just let's take one point, what he did as editor, what he accepted, what he promoted in the Pastoral Review. I'm very grateful personally to St Mary's University for the joy and privilege of delivering the Michael Hayes Memorial Lecture. Michael was a true life giver. I did things for him, but I received ever so much from Michael. He was a genuine Easter person, and he died in God's providence on Holy Saturday 2017. And his last editorial for the Pastoral Review said this: "Seeing in a new life," this developed his theme of Christ's resurrection, which he called an abiding presence that changes the way everything is perceived. A remarkably good reflection that brings out at least a deep aspect of the resurrection. It's an abiding presence that changes the way everything is perceived. Michael himself has entered into that abiding eternal presence, and he's done that, but only after he helped so many people to perceive the world in a new way. And for that, I'd just like to say to him, Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Collins. In 2 minutes, I'll be asking the Vice-Chancellor of St Mary's University, Professor Francis Campbell, to offer an official vote of thanks for Father Jerry. Just prior to that, we've got Dr. North, Karen, and John, Dr. Lydon here. Just to offer, John's got a short message from Mary Immaculate College to be read out, if they'd asked for this to be read out on this occasion. And Karen's got the prayer cards. As you know, about a year after someone's death in Ireland, the prayer cards are issued, and she's got some of those to hand out. She worked with Michael in Roehampton and obviously studied with him here too. Thank you also to Laura for help with those. So, John, could you just say something on behalf of Professor Eugene Wall, who's the President of Mary Immaculate College, Limerick?
Thank you very much, Professor Town. On behalf of Professor Eugene Wall, below please find a tribute to Professor Hayes on behalf of Mary Immaculate College on the occasion of the inaugural memorial lecture in his honour this Saturday evening. Michael A. Hayes brought to Mary Immaculate College a transformative zeal that was Catholic in its intent, holistic in its extent, and thoroughgoing in its execution. The occasion of this memorial lecture is bittersweet for the Mary Immaculate community, as it simultaneously reminds us of what we have lost and of the legacy that remains. Michael became editor of the Pastoral Review in 2004, a position he held until his untimely death. His editorial focus was on providing insights into pastoral initiatives that were to have a high impact on an evolving church. Academically grounded, pastorally and liturgically literate, and ecclesially faithful. This was the same approach he brought to Mary Immaculate College. Shifting his focus from pastoral theology to education, he placed the student at the heart of his deliberations, ensuring that the whole energy of the college was directed to producing the finest graduates across multiple disciplines. In Michael's imitable style, he put it thus in his inaugural address, describing his vision for Mary Immaculate as an institution at the service of human flourishing in a plural environment, with Christianity as a privileged partner in the dialogue. His primary goal was to spread this Catholic view of education far and wide. that the college's primary mission was the flourishing of the individual for the good of society, in an environment enlightened by both the Catholic intellectual tradition and the Church's social teaching. This was not some lofty aspiration. As president, Michael set out to speak the truth to power, establishing Mary Immaculate College as the largest Catholic higher education institution in Ireland, and resolutely defending it against those who would seek to either secularise Catholic education or reduce it to instrumental utilitarianism for the economy. He established 3 research institutes in the college: the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies, the Institute for Educational and Social Policy Studies, and the Institute for Irish Studies. Created linkages with the International Federation of Catholic Universities, established the college as the Irish locus of the Santa Marta Project, and engaged intensively with civil society, connecting town and gown in myriads of ways. He was open to the world and unafraid to engage, and he saw that there was no place for ivory towers nor any other form of elitism. On this occasion of the memorial lecture, we mourn his passing. We give thanks for what he achieved, and we look forward to building on his legacy. And this tribute by Mary Immaculate College ends with an epitaph written in Irish, which I can't pronounce, but I have had it translated. I translated rather, "May his soul be seated on God's right hand."
So with thanks to the family who shared the prayer cards with us, and now hand over to Professor Campbell.
Thank you, Anthony. So this is a gentleman, Jerry O'Collins, that he alluded to in the talk, and Anthony opened by saying how helpful Jerry was to a whole generation of students that went through his hands. Now, most of you will think of the students as those sitting in lectures, perhaps not as comfortable as you are right now in the Gregorian. The seats are wooden, they're not soft. But it wasn't only the students that, or a student in an academic setting of a university that benefited from his wisdom, because nearly every single ambassador or diplomat that went through Rome over the course of how many decades, I dare to say, literally before they would send their signals or their telegrams back to capital cities, there was one person you would call Jerry O'Collins. And indeed, a very prominent VIP, when coming to Britain, or coming from Britain to the Holy See, read the brief about who she would meet. And the brief from the British Embassy read, Professor Jerry O'Collins, brackets, nationality Australian, close brackets. And then it said below, popes come and go, Jerry O'Collins remains. When she met the said Jerry O'Collins, she said, "Oh, you're still here?" I can think of no better individual to give the inaugural lecture on Professor Michael Hayes by someone who shared with him 3 Ps: pastor, professor, and the most important word which we've heard this evening as he has gone through what Michael Hayes did in his life, in what he taught, in what he wrote, in what he acted on. The 2 of them share the prophetic sense. That prophetic sense is here in the words of the Pastoral Review and the analysis of the Papacy that we have heard this evening so eloquently put by Jerry. A wonderful tour de force, not only of the Papacy of Pope Francis, but also indeed of the prophetic voice of the Papacy across different reigns, the distinction between the individual and the office.
and how much of that distinction is lost in the contemporary analysis, which seems to only focus on the office or confuse the personality of the holder of the office with the office. It's fundamentally not Catholic, and that's what we've heard this evening from Jerry. And there's probably one thing that I don't know if he knows this, but the pulpit that he was speaking from this evening, I think Jerry came here in 2008, Anthony. Is that right? He left Rome, and it very much was Rome's loss but St. Mary's gain. But in 2010, somebody else came from Rome, came to here, and they spoke at this pulpit. And one of the things that Jerry was prophetic about back in 2006 were the changes on interreligious dialogue and the whole area of reciprocity, which began to take hold in some parts of Christian thinking, that you extend welcome to someone in this context because you are welcome here. And I remember Jerry saying at the time, there is no conditionality in terms. Reciprocity is not something that is a condition of Christian thinking. But at this pulpit in September 2010, and in this room, it was in this room that Pope Benedict met 140 representatives of faith communities, where he addressed this group alongside the chief rabbi and alongside Baroness Saida Varsi, the first Muslim in the British cabinet. So Jerry, it's a delight to have you here this evening. It's a delight to have you back home at St. Mary's University. It's a delight to have you speaking at this pulpit and to see that you have spoken so highly of someone that clearly, from what you have said this evening, had a huge impact on your life. And indeed, in that sense, I believe it was reciprocal, that the relationship between yourself and the late Michael Hayes. Nobody could have given a better inaugural lecture. Nobody could have given a better tribute than you have this evening. And for that, and for what you shared with Michael, of being both a pastor, a priest, a professor, and indeed being prophetic, I would like to thank you on behalf of everyone here this evening and of St. Mary's University. Thank you, Gerald. And final word, all this has been put together by this gentleman here. No doubt with many helpers, probably one of them sitting over here, Karen. One person who's not here this evening but is a sponsor of this is Paul Beresford Hill, who is unable to travel due to illness in New York, was a good friend of Michael Hayes. And if we could just, for a moment in a private prayer, just think of Paul and wish him a quick recovery and a speedy recovery. But just to say, Anthony, thank you very much for everything you've done to put together this conference and to set off this inaugural lecture. I think it's a wonderful 2 days and we're all very proud of what you've done. Thank you very much.
I did say that I'd give the Vice-Chancellor the last word, but I have to say, he mentioned the interreligious dialogue. Please note, beneath your bahukis and around here are Jerry's latest books, one on Liturgicum Authenticum and one forthcoming from Orbis on Christology of all religions. Christology in all religions. And he will be speaking tomorrow at his workshop. You're all welcome to the conference if you want to come back tomorrow. But thanks for coming tonight. Heartfelt and very grateful. Good night, God bless.
Thank you.